Hi friends, this is Janelle. I'm going to give you a quick walkthrough of these bylaws. I created them because I've worked with a lot of nonprofits, many of whom find typical bylaws really awkward. Awkward is to say the least. Many bylaws are just filled with legalese. They alienate people, they intimidate people, and it's just not conducive to creating highly participatory organizations. So you can come back and read more here about the thinking and purpose of these bylaws. They are intended for land organizations, but truthfully, any nonprofit can adapt these to your purposes. I've just been working with a lot of land stewardship organizations lately, and I think land stewardship in particular is work that requires that everyone involved be participating in governance, meaning it's really not realistic to think that a removed and disinterested board of directors can be making the decisions about what's happening on land. The decisions are really made throughout the land. So I wrote about that, and you can come read it. And there's really three things that I highlight that are unique about these bylaws. One is that they're just really short. I tried to be minimalistic. I worked to have them comply with California nonprofit corporation law and 501c3 law, but I tried to do the minimum necessary. And then I also include a little disclaimer here that I am merely human and there's probably stuff in the law that I missed. So use these at your own risk. But I tried to keep it short and simple. It's designed to create space to acknowledge and support highly adaptive participatory forms of governance. And it is also, it includes a section to protect land from the speculative market. So those are the three things that make this unique. You'll find that below each slide are notes that will give you more background and tips. And under many slides, I actually paste references to the California Corporations Code, which is the set of rules that's really constrained what can go into these bylaws. All of that said, here's the first page of the bylaws. It starts with purpose and orienting principles, which every organization will want to adapt to their own actual purposes. And I included some notes about why this is especially important in these bylaws because one is they're trying to support a living governance system. I mean, thinking of organizations as living organisms, a governance system is not a static thing. It's not something that you can encode and then stick to. It's just always adapting as the activities of the organization are adapting. But you don't want to just say, okay, there's no structure whatsoever. And of course, there's a famous essay about how a lot of organizations that tried to be egalitarian ended up devolving into a tyranny of structurelessness where the existing supremacies, patriarchy, white supremacy, ended up taking hold and power would get concentrated and so on. And so the orienting principles in particular, by orient, it means it's like we're going to move in this direction and not this other direction. And so I included three statements here that are particularly important to say, okay, even though we're a living governance system and we're always adapting, there's always a certain direction that we're moving, which is toward empowerment of everyone and inclusion, participation, healing, active repair of the harms of historic oppression, and away from systems of domination and exclusion and so on. So I think that's a really important piece. And the other reason it's very important is, as you'll see in a minute, the role of the board of directors is constrained in the sense that the board is not there to direct everything that happens. It's there to be, I'll go ahead and skip to that, guardians of this living governance system. And so it says the role of the board is to support that system and intervene and exercise their authority only when they see a threat of harm or if they see that the organization is drifting away from its purpose and orienting principles. So that's the guideline for when the board really gets involved and starts bossing people around. And unfortunately, with any form of corporation, you can't avoid the fact that a board is legally required. And generally, the law will say something to the effect that the organization is operating under the ultimate direction of the board. So they do have the control at the end of the day. they also have a duty of care. They could be potentially liable if they over-delegate their roles and stop paying attention. So if you're going to use a corporate form, which not every nonprofit has to do. Many nonprofits could choose to be unincorporated associations and have a lot more flexibility, and you wouldn't need a board. But assuming you do form a corporation and you need a board, this is a way to help the directors exercise their duty of care, but without over-delegating their duties, basically. So I'm going to go now to the second page of the bylaws, which is just very basic information about the board, the number of directors, how the board will once per year get together and say, hey, should we add any new directors? Should we subtract any directors? This is truthfully how most organizations do it. Many organizations don't pay attention to the terms, or they forget, like, oh, wait, were we supposed to have board elections? So, and then this also says, like, you want to create a board where everyone is really engaged and also getting along with each other. And so it's like every year you kind of recraft the board and you think about like who feels right to add or subtract. And here's another thing that's very unique about these bylaws, which is that it says that the board will have a president, secretary, and treasurer. And in fact, these people don't even necessarily have to be on the board, but these are called officers under the law, which is a word that is no fun because it sounds like some kind of police. So, but you're required to have them under the law. So this says have a president, secretary, and treasurer, but they're going to have no particular responsibilities other than to sign official documents that require these special titles. So I included the code. The California code says that you need to have the president, secretary, and treasurer, but and that there's no or that the bylaws can really specify what their responsibilities are. And I just specified that they don't have particular responsibilities. And of course, you could give them responsibilities. I just think that a lot of times people end up feeling like this forces a kind of hierarchy on them that they don't want. Okay, I've already mentioned this slide on the role of the board. You need to address board meetings and decisions and how those go. So yeah, how often the meetings are, and if you want to have a meeting that's not on a particular schedule, who can call that and with how much notice, and how is the notice sent. So that's all addressed here. And then how does the board make decisions? I put in 2/3, approval by 2/3. I mean, actually, truthfully, what I would want to put here sometimes is that every item will be discussed with the goal of the consent, of getting the consent of all directors. But a lot of times if you say you want all directors to consent, that can hold things up quite a bit. And then under California law, at least, you can't make decisions in writing unless all the board members approve it. So I put the code in here, and that's why there's a different threshold depending on whether decisions are made in meetings or outside of meetings. You'll notice there's no quorum, no mention of quorum. And that is because even if you're in a meeting, if only 2/3 of the directors are there, it means all of the directors there have to approve a decision, because this says that when you're in the meeting, you still need 2/3 of all directors to approve a decision. So stating it in that way means we don't have to talk about quorum. So this slide is about what's usually called conflict of interest. If the board is about to make a decision that could financially benefit one of the directors, then what most nonprofits have is something called a conflict of interest policy, and they tend to model it off of this thing from the IRS, sample conflict of interest policy. But look, it's really long, and nobody ever remembers all the details of it. It's very clunky to follow, and in fact, we created a handout about conflict of interest policies. It includes a video where I complain about them, and then we offer some samples. Sample at the very bottom of just how you can make it very, very short. So that's what I did here. And the important thing will be to document the thinking behind the decisions, because the purpose of all of this is to make sure the nonprofit is serving the public and not the private financial benefit of the board members, the decision makers. So you can still make decisions that benefit board members. You just want to make sure that it's in the best interest of the organization and that the director is not charging more than you would have to pay if you were to go get this in, in the so-called fair market. So I hope that makes sense. You can come back and read more. All right, so those were the elements that are the most typical. It's very short of bylaws. This is something you don't normally see in bylaws, but I included it. And this is because a lot of organizations are forming. They want to permanently remove land from the speculative market. And there's so many things that are necessary to really protect land in the long term. And a lot of it's just relational. Like you want to build a web of relationships around land so that people will show up and defend the land from attack and take care of it, make sure it's financially sound, all of that. But you can also put some things in your bylaws. This is a kind of a minimalist approach in other bylaws, and I included a link to a video here you could watch where I talk about other strategies we've used in actual bylaws. But this basically says, no, you can't sell the land on the market. I mean, the organization can't sell the land. It can sell it to other similar organizations that are going to steward the land. But if it sells it to them, it needs to do so at a price that's really set to satisfy the debts and expenses associated with it, i.e., you don't want to sell it to these other organizations with the goal of earning a profit. Now, sometimes an organization will want to make an exception to that. Let's say they have a house and it's just like nobody wants this house anymore. No other organization wants to step in and steward it. Then you can amend this particular page of the bylaws to say that it does not apply to that house. But to do that, you would go and get the permission of the land protector. So this would be a list of people that you put here who, imagine the people who are deeply supportive of the organization and have demonstrated long-term support. You can put their names here. And then if you are going to make an exception to this rule, you run it by them, basically by saying, hey, can we make an exception in the bylaws to allow us to sell this one particular house? And there's a little process here for how you reach out to those land protectors and get their approval. So it's just a safeguard in case the board starts making decisions and selling off land. It just slows things down and makes sure there's some thought put into it. Now this page is not even necessary really, but I put it in here because a lot of outside institutions like banks and title companies, they're obsessed with knowing who is allowed to sign on behalf of the organization and make binding commitments on behalf of the organization. And so they want to see official looking paper. So I included an official looking feather here, but you could show them this page of the bylaws to say, hey, this person is empowered to sign. Even then they might say, no, we want to see a really specific resolution by the board authorizing you to open a bank account or buy land. So even with this page in here, you might still have to go to the board and create more paperwork from time to time. And then there's this final thing, which is not even really part of the bylaws, but it's a thing you can attach to the end of it to commemorate that the bylaws were adopted and when and how. And there you go. Basically, these are very short bylaws, and I should say some of what it leaves out is just lots of little detailed procedures, deadlines about when notice needs to be provided for this or that thing. It also, a lot of bylaws will just reiterate the law. They'll say, you need to keep records. You need to provide a financial report to the board. If you ever have more than $2 million in income, you need to get a financial audit. Those are things that the law says, but it's not necessary to put those things in your bylaws. You still have to adhere to them or try. And so I made a suggestion that every organization should just have a kind of a nonprofit legal compliance checklist. Sustainable Economies Law Center has one that we created for ourselves. And then we've created some for our clients. And it tends to be different with every organization. With land organizations, there's even more to do every year. But there's no reason to clutter the bylaws with that kind of information. So, yeah, I hope these are useful to you. Thanks for listening.